Yeah, I think the messiness is such a great representation, especially now, because we see so much on the internet of people being like, oh, this federal judge is striking us down, and which is great and wonderful. And at the same time, we have a Supreme Court that tomorrow is likely to rule in favor of 303 creative. And so when you think about the messiness, even within the judicial system, even within appointees of Trump who are all disagreeing with each other, it's hard to look at this one country, to look at this one system and say, what does it value? What does it really care about? As history has taught us, we've never been one voice. We've always been a cacophony of all of these different ones. And it's just whichever one happens to win out in this moment. I love Martin Luther King's quote that the world bends toward justice, both because it's a great hope, but also it's such a funny and kind of awful thing to rely on, that the world will do it, when in fact the only thing that will do it is us. So many people use that as like, oh, I don't have to go vote because the world is always getting better. And I think history has shown that it does not.
No, I call this the paradox of progress, this idea that these movements to advance rights and freedom, equality, and justice, right, enjoy certain kinds of victories and progress. And then there's always the backlash that is ready to pounce. The most dangerous thing that we can believe is that progress is inevitable and irreversible. It is neither things. The only way we get to a place of progress is, as you said, referring to the King quote, bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. Interestingly, that gets quoted from King, and King was actually quoting Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist minister and activist in the 19th century. And Theodore Parker was the first person to say that, and then King takes that, which is totally in line with King's theology and also his prophetic rhetorical work, which he was always drawing deep from history. And so he was quoting Theodore Parker, who was very close with Frederick Douglass and John Brown. Theodore Parker said that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice and said we must do it. He was also part of the group called the Secret Six, which is a group of wealthy backers of John Brown's raid. Kansas. And so Theodore Parker was saying, bend that arc towards justice, people, at the same time that he was giving money to buy guns for John Brown to do the anti-slavery work that he was doing in places like Kansas and Harper's Ferry, etc. Theodore Parker saying that and giving guns to John Brown, and then Martin Luther King, the great, nonviolent civil disobedience civil rights activist, quoting that again, right? Again, it's messy. And I think that history is messy and we're messy. And the worst thing we can do, other than believe that progress is inevitable and irreversible, right, is to somehow believe that we're not a mess, that we don't all contain multitudes and contradictions. The point is to identify them, to reckon with them, and maybe resolve them, but to understand that history is not fueled by consensus. It's fueled by conflict. Conflict drives history, which is why the history of social movements should be at the center of any understanding of American history and certainly of American democracy.
So jumping to more fun questions, I think we all know Bette Midler from Hocus Pocus, and if you're queer, First Wives Club, but not many people realize how much of a queer ally she really is. What makes her so special to the queer community? And feel free to talk about her work in the bathhouses.
Yeah. So Bette Midler, God bless her, Bette Midler, one of the reasons why she's as beloved as a diva in our community is because she got her start singing in gay bathhouses, particularly the Continental Baths in New York City, which were in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel. And the Continental Baths were open from 1968, so a year before Stonewall, and they closed in 1976. And I'll get to why they closed in a second. It was before the AIDS crisis when all the bathhouses were sort of shut down in major cities. across the country. But Bette Midler was one of many musical acts that got their start, or that performed regularly in the Continental Baths. And they would have these performances that would take place, and they would let people in. The public could come and buy tickets and so forth. But these were bathhouses where gay men would go and have sex, and were going to have sex. And yet they were also these sort of concert venues. And Bette Midler got her start there. She actually recorded an album, I think in 1972, called Bathhouse Betty. And that was her nickname early on in her career. And gay men were her earliest kind of constituency. And so not only was she referred to as Bathhouse Betty, a moniker that she still embraces. She's still to this day in interviews, and people say, well, tell us about where you got the Bathhouse Betty. She said, I am proud of this. Like, she said, I helped, participate in the early gay and lesbian liberation movement. And she owns that, which I absolutely love. And the Divine Miss M was another way that she was referred to as her stage persona within these bathhouses. So Bathhouse Betty's an album she recorded, and there are actually audio tapes of one of these performances. She gets the moniker, or the nickname, Divine Miss M, which she used for many, many years and still also embraces today. Interestingly, one of the things about Bette Midler that is fascinating is that she performed with a whole band, and her pianist was Barry Manilow, who would sometimes perform with just a towel on, like the other gay men in the bathhouse. And so they would be having, I don't know if Barry Manilow had sex in the bathhouse, who knows? Maybe, probably. Certainly he was identifying in that way. But these folks would like walk around, they'd have sex, and they'd come to the concert, and they'd listen to Bette Midler and Barry Manilow and others perform. And then the concert would be over and everyone would leave. At the end of the concert, they used to say, okay, ladies, as soon as you can get yourselves together, you need to leave and let the boys go back to their fun. They would like make an announcement, like sort of like, get home safely or whatever, or like, tip the bartender. It was like, gotta leave, ladies, because the boys are gonna go have their own disco. And but this was a common occurrence in the baths, and Bette Midler was really in some ways the star of this whole kind of bathhouse circuit that existed in New York and San Francisco and LA and other places. It ultimately was shut down, in part because the owner, Ostro, I forget what his first, Steve Ostro, I think, the owner of the Continental Baths, what they were criticizing him because too many straight people were coming. Too many people were coming to these concerts, and they basically said, we feel like we're zoo animals. And so there was a critique of the invasion of those spaces, right, which were safe sex spaces, by the public and by the straight society. And so he ultimately closed it down. It didn't have anything to do with AIDS. Many of the bathhouses were closed when the AIDS epidemic took root. But it was closed because he was like, I'm going to make more money. So the gay men stopped coming, or the numbers were dwindling. And so as a business proposition, he opened up another swingers club right around the corner the next year, called Plato's Retreat. It was called Plato's Retreat. There are all these references to ancient Rome and Greece. Shortly thereafter, that was ultimately closed down, actually, in the wave of closing of bathhouses during the AIDS epidemic. But he basically, it was closed because, straight people were ruining the bathhouses for gay men, which is very interesting because I think about now, right? I live in Provincetown, and one of the things that we see over and over and over again, and increasingly, are these like straight white women who come for their bachelorette parties, and they come, my husband refers to them as the white woo girls, because they get drunk and they're like, woo, woo, and they take pictures with drag queens. And there are literally signs in bars in Provincetown that are essentially channeling that energy. Like, we're not zoo animals. Like, we're not here to perform for you. This is where we live. This is who we are. And these are our spaces. So respect us and respect them. And so I think, I'm constantly looking for through lines. And I think one of the through lines, though the gays loved Bathhouse Betty and the Divine Miss M, it was the crowds that came to infiltrate those spaces that ultimately became a problem. But I sort of love the fact that Bette Midler, who's had this absolutely spectacular career and is still a spectacular talent, got her start right in these 100%. These sex clubs, basically.
When I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, there's only really two or three gay bars there. And one of the most popular is called Play, and Play has become a real lightning rod right now because it is the center of a lot of drag conversations.
Right.
But at the same time, it gets a lot of its money from the bachelorette parties who come to Nashville to have fun. And then at the end of the night, they're like, well, we're tired of men trying to grab us. So we're going to go to the gay bar and we're going to watch a great drag show and we're going to patronize this. And, there were many nights where women were there and respectful and wonderful and great. And there are others where they were not so respectful and people had to say something. There's always this question with ally groups of how much can you infiltrate a space and how much can you be there to help the space, to revere it while not taking over it. And I think that as a scholar of civil rights and the Black movement, that's a big question coming from both the historical perspective, but also from the Black Lives Matter movement only a couple of years ago, where that became a huge fever pitch of performative activism.
Performative allyship,
Yeah.
All movements need allies.
Yeah.
I mean, I think any of us who are from groups that have historically been disenfranchised and discriminated against understand that we can't win alone, but we should be at the center of our own movements and our own representations and speak for ourselves. I consider myself a social justice activist and have been my whole life, certainly my whole adult life, but even when I was younger. And I like to tell people, because I came out late, that I was a feminist, an anti-racist, a pacifist, a socialist, right, and all these other things before I was a homosexual. And I mean, maybe not really like a homosexual by sort of instinct and temperament and even practice, but you know what I mean. Before I came out, like, I was engaged in racial justice advocacy and feminist advocacy and peace advocacy and economic justice advocacy long before I ever attended my first LGBTQ march or pride or even went into my first gay bar. And that I've learned a lot from that, because I am not the center of those movements. I've been a participant in those movements and I've been an ally of those movements, and I still am. And so I understand the need to show up and to speak up, but also to step back and listen and follow, right, and participate, and also continue to show up. I think that's the thing for me. And it gets back to this point of respect, because I do think we don't talk about respect enough when we talk about solidarity. Solidarity, not just allyship, but solidarity, which is a deep and sustained commitment to another person's liberation, because all of our liberation is caught up together. And I believe that deeply. And so it is a matter of respect, of listening, of following, of asking what you can do, but of showing up over and over and over again. And I think that's the thing about, when you show up to one place once, and I'm sure there are lovely people who come to these bachelorette parties. I've been to bachelor and bachelorette parties myself, but like, it is a one-time thing and it's very self-centered, right? And so you're coming to get what you need and you're leaving, and that can be quite offensive to folks. So having a kind of respect, and one way to show respect for other people and for other groups, communities, and movements is to keep showing up for them.
Yep.
Right. And to not want to take credit for that. I always say, if you're an ally, what matters most is how often you show up, and also what you do when the other group is not in the room. Right. Yep. I say to my straight friends, I was like, well, what do you say when people say homophobic things to you when I'm not around? Right. How do you act? Same thing with white people. Like, what do you do in a room filled with white people when they say something crazy about Black people or immigrants or whatever? Yeah. Right. Like, what are you saying? Like, that's the true test. And if we're an ally, even if we show up all the time, we shouldn't expect a trophy, because we're already too late. So get to work, get to step in. And I mean, I really believe that. And I see that on both sides, right? I see that as someone who has been an ally in solidarity with other movements and other communities, and also as someone who is part of my own movement, part of my own community, who, deals with allies or potential allies or, fallen allies all the time, as well as adversaries. And, it's a longer conversation, but I think it's a really important one, because ultimately, as I said before, none of us can get free, right, alone.
Whenever people ask me, how do I be a better ally? I think they're wanting to be this perfect paragon of what it is. And to be honest, you're never going to get there. There's no way you can be that. There is no one who is that. And so I think to come at it as this just respect and showing up and consistency and knowing that you're going to make mistakes sometimes and being okay with that, and knowing that that action is so much better than the full-on attacks of other people doing and just the not doing anything. For me, I think it's always just so nice when people just want to show up and work consistently to do it. And sometimes people just get into the trapping of, well, I'm never going to be perfect at it, so I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just not going to do anything.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I talk to my students all the time about robust reciprocity, which is something that we need to practice and commit to build communities. And what I mean by that is that we all show up for each other, and that we take and we get, but we also give, right, and offer up. And that is really important. I always ask all my students at the beginning of every class, Queer Nation, and all the classes I teach, I always ask them, I said, what do you need from this classroom community to thrive and flourish? And what are you willing to give and offer so that other people can thrive and flourish? And I have them fill that out. And then we post all the things that people need and take, and all the things that people give. So I call it my give and get question. And students really love it. They're like, wow, I wish we thought about this more intentionally in every community we're in, because that kind of robust reciprocity, knowing that I am going to take and get from this community, hopefully, right? And that I need something we need things from other people, but we also need to reciprocate in a robust way. And to me, that's how we get, right? That's how we practice respect to get to solidarity.
Yeah.
Really how I think about it. And, again, to your point though, perfection is not the aspiration. Perfection is not the aspiration. The sooner we get over that, because that gets in the way of all sorts of things. It gets in the way of how we speak or whether we speak, because we're afraid to say the wrong thing. Right? I say the wrong thing like 100 times a day. Keep it moving. Apologize if what you say offends someone, and then don't do it again, right? Learn from it. The only way we can get better is if we make mistakes and we learn from it. But that also requires us to give a little grace too to folks who don't always say the right thing. And anybody who's ever come out to a person who's a little uncomfortable with you being gay or queer, right, is like, what those awkward conversations are. And the question is, are they going to get over their discomfort to accept you and embrace you? And are you willing to give them a little bit of grace so that you can get to a place where you can feel that acceptance? And I know there are people who are purists about this, and I'm just not that way. I guess, I don't know if I'm too old or too imperfect myself, but I really do believe that extension of grace is part of the process of creating more robust and respectful allies.
Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate it. You have a good day.
Take care.